Hello and welcome to This is the Way. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. This podcast episode is sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab. The Hong Kong Ethics Lab, everyone, is also sponsoring an event that Richard and I have known about for quite some time, but keep forgetting to mention, which is a live event, our first ever live recording of the show, which is going to be happening at the Pacific Division meeting of the American Philosophical Association, which will take place on April 17th at the Westin St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, 2025. So I kind of presented that information in the wrong order. The date to know is April 17th, 2025. We actually already know that the recording will happen at 4 to 6 p.m. That's a Thursday, and it's at the Westin St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. That's actually a meeting of professional philosophers, and the American Philosophical Association is also a sponsor of this event. After all, they're providing the venue and so much of the kind of logistics that we need. So we're very excited about it. We expect professional philosophers to be there, but we also expect the general public will be there. I've already heard from a few people of the general public who plan to attend, and it's great. Richard and I have never done this before, but it's been recommended to us even by some staff. Thank you, Catherine Goldstein at HKU, first proposed this idea. And I think it's safe to say we're both kind of nervous, right? It's like we've been performing in some sense for an audience of hundreds or thousands, in the sense that lots of people download and listen to the show, but never before a live audience. And so we're just not sure how it's going to go, but we have to jump in. Right? We have to dive in and try it out now and then, or sooner or later if we want to do it. And we even have chosen a topic, and we have chosen our guest. So our topic will be Neo-Confucian criticisms, or we'll just say Confucian criticisms of Buddhism. So it's kind of a debate, Confucianism versus Buddhism as ways of life, as philosophical religious worldviews to adopt. And it should be great fun. We're bringing in Jenny Hung, a professor of philosophy who's very articulate about Chinese Buddhism at University of Hong Kong Science and Technology. And Richard is going to kind of moderate the debate. And I think it's safe to say Richard will be relatively, I think you're a good moderator, Richard. I think you're dispositionally neutral on the issue, and whether Confucianism and Buddhism is the better way. Anyway, I trust you to be a good moderator in these cases.
Yes. But that should be a great debate, interesting conversation. And, we're not, obviously, if you've listened to us for a while, we're not really combative by nature. I don't think, or maybe I used to be, but anyways, that part has rubbed off as part of my nature. And Jenny is a wonderful, kind, compassionate human being, really knows Buddhism very well. And in fact, she is so smart. She also has a PhD in physics. So there you go.
Yes,
and in philosophy.
Yeah,
and she's publishing some amazing stuff, like really great books on Buddhism and metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and also so humble. Like if you talk to her, you would think like, I don't know, she's not even like an academic. She's like one of the most humble people I've ever met. And so that's going to be a really terrific conversation. And if anyone's around San Francisco, or if you have the money to get over there, you should stop by and say hello. That'd be amazing to meet our listeners.
Yes, exactly. So the professional philosophers, most of them in the English-speaking world, are members of the American Philosophical Association, and they can attend. They know how to do it. Those of you who aren't professional philosophers, there's going to be a way for you to attend this meeting, and we'll provide details on the blog for Chinese philosophy, Warp, Weft, and Way. That's Warp, W-A-R-P, Weft, W-E-F-T, and Way, W-A-Y. And there we often post discussions of this particular podcast series. Each episode has a kind of supporting page with more details and links. We're also going to post guidelines for those who want to attend. And this is all just a reminder of something that Richard and I both really cherish, which is that we constantly get really good feedback from listeners. We get emails, we get messages on various social media sites, and of course on Warp, Weft, and Way, the aforementioned website or blog. And it's just very gratifying for us. And we're learning a lot about what we do well and what we don't do well. One point of contention, I must say, Richard, I think it's a point of contention that, maybe I'd say on balance, maybe more people favor one side than another. But I do hear some debate about this segment. Every episode begins with a kind of opening casual discussion casual chit chat, we actually call it informally, between Richard and me, where we talk about our lives and how things are going, maybe some ideas that occurred to us. And I have some colleagues who are true philosophy geeks, who just love the philosophy, who have told me they skip past this part and go straight to part two, the second segment, where we talk about particular themes and passages. I have to say, I don't mind. My feelings are not hurt because I'm amazed that I have colleagues who basically don't do Chinese philosophy at all, do really formal stuff primarily, in philosophy of language, epistemology, or what have you, and still listen to the show. So it's, for me, it's an achievement that they're listening. On the other hand, I would say that the preponderance of feedback that we get about this particular issue is that people like the first segment a lot. And maybe the listeners who've chimed in on this issue could elaborate. But my hunch is that generally speaking, people just like knowing the hosts of the podcast. They like to know the people that they're hearing from. Maybe there's more we can say, like, you can get some sense of the ways in which Taoism, Confucianism, these philosophical texts and worldviews that we study have affected our own lives, and that's valuable information. But also, I just think in general, people, as human beings, we like to have a kind of personality profile on which to hang points, ideas, arguments that we're listening to and hearing about and learning.
Yeah, I think you tend to want to know the people. Like musicians, you want to know, oh, what are they like? Once in a while, I remember I'll search like an actor's name, like an actor that I really like. I don't know, maybe let's say like Anthony Hopkins,
Yeah.
And I would like look into Core, like, oh, has anyone met him? Like, what's he like in real life? And I always had hope that when it comes to those actors I really like, that the people would share stories that are uplifting or that shows that they're, like good, kind people, generous people. Like everyone knows that, like, I think there are a lot of stories about like Keanu Reeves, for example. Like he takes a subway, he sits next to a homeless guy and eats a sandwich, and people really like him more for that. So I think people want to know the person as well. We think through narratives often. We want to relate to them. We want to connect with them. So I think that's definitely maybe a part of the desire. I don't know, but I wonder what our listeners think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little odd for me, of course, because I'm not used to being scrutinized in this way. But it's really quite nice to know that it adds something for those of you who do listen to the first segment to the show.
For a while, for the first several episodes, basically it was Justin, you just asking me or saying, oh my gosh, Richard has 4 kids. Richard has 4 kids. True. Like, oh, I don't know how you do it. Maybe because you are still like astounded by, and actually, to be honest with you, it's a lot of work, and I'm still not sure how I carry on and stay awake. But yeah, so maybe that was a little repetitive. Maybe that's what put off some of your colleagues with the first part. But
come to think of it, that's maybe it was, But I'm still amazed, Richard. So to me, it really does seem superhuman. What's a good example is in preparation for these recordings, it doesn't always work out that I have time to sort of psychologically prepare, but I would say 60 to 70% of the time I do have time. So I get up sometimes as early as 4:30 or 5 a.m., which may sound like ridiculous, but it's not that hard for me to get up that early. Go to bed early, you get up early. And so that means that I have some time to kind of read stuff and think about the points that we might hit on and kind of draft an outline of how the opening discussion might go and that kind of thing. And that means that I'm in the headspace that I think is more conducive to these podcast episodes, to a good philosophical discussion. Whereas oftentimes I can tell, Richard, you sort of plop down at the desk, you flip on Zoom, plop down the desk, you're still like frantically getting out your headphones to plug them in and, like apologizing for being late because you had to drop your kids off or what have you. And so, in addition to the fact that you are raising 4 little children that are rapidly becoming adults and worrying about how to shape them and all that stuff, I just can't wrap my mind around this idea that you're able to like go from parenting mode with young children to philosophy mode. So I'm sorry to go on and on about it, but that's still the thing that amazes me about it, Richard, is that like no matter what headspace you were in, and I think when you're parenting 4 kids, it's a very different headspace, you're still able to flip on the switch and talk philosophy.
Well, I mean, I enjoy these conversations so much, to be really honest. But no, my life does feel very frantic. I find myself just rushing. I don't know. There's this movie, Will Smith, The Pursuit of Unhappiness. it's an okay movie. It's kind of uplifting sometimes, but it's all right. But
Yeah.
in that movie, because he starts off as this homeless guy and trying to raise his
Oh,
little
yeah.
boy,
I've seen it.
and he's just
Yeah.
running everywhere. If you've seen that movie, basically I
Yeah.
feel like that all the time. Like I'm just running around.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is like chaotic, and your sleep is still bad, but it's joyful and meaningful in different ways. So yeah. So, anyways, no, I'm so glad we can still do this. And to be honest, for all the listeners, this is true. I mean, Justin, I think you put in a lot more work into the podcast than
Oh,
me at this point. I feel like you put on those great posts on Warp Weft and Way, and I just don't have the time to do as much. And you correspond with the emails in much more detail, and so I really appreciate all that. I hope I can do more. Maybe once the kid wants to, like my
kids are
one
grown
year
up.
old is more like 5, that would help. And
Oh, okay.
so maybe down the road.
Yeah, well, it's entirely understandable. I'm always sympathetic, Richard, and I wouldn't say I put that much more effort into it, but at the very least, I take some time right before each show to kind of put myself in the right headspace.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think we should all put ourselves in the headspace. We have a today's topic, which is coming up after the break.
Yeah, we are finally getting around to the later Confucian tradition, which is known as often as Neo-Confucianism. So most of our conversations has focused on what we might call the early Confucian tradition. There are several texts. We haven't actually discussed all of them, like, for example, the Xunzi, but we've spent time discussing Confucius's Analects, the Mengzi. But later on, Confucianism kept going and extending, and there's been really important, influential thinkers in the later Confucian tradition. And Neo Confucianism is also very complex in that it was also influenced deeply by Buddhism and Taoism and developed a much more kind of metaphysical framework. So,
Mhm.
what it did was it sort of integrated especially the ethical framework of early Confucianism together with various metaphysical doctrines and ideas, in
Mhm.
part because I think it was trying to respond to, for example, the Buddhist metaphysics in its own way. And so, one of the most pivotal, maybe the most important thinker in the Neo Confucian tradition is Zhu Xi, who lived during the Song dynasty. And so, we're going to focus on Zhu Xi and introduce some of the Neo-Confucian metaphysical ideas, especially in Zhu Xi, and focusing especially on the concept of Li. So that's basically our topic for today. And we also have a great guest, Stephen Engel, over at Wesleyan, who's an expert
Yes.
in this material. So, Justin, do you want to say a bit more about this?
Yeah, that was a very good introduction. Yeah, so we have classical Confucianism, and nowadays when people think of the great classical Confucians, we think of the three big texts that survived, the Analects, the Mencius, and the Xunzi. We've talked a lot about the Analects and the Mencius. Actually, there are a number of classical Confucian texts. There's also the rites, the record of rituals, and others. But the three philosophers I mentioned are the big three. And they all lived before the rise of the Qing dynasty, before the so-called first emperor. And Confucianism continued well after that, it continues up to the present day. By the time we get to the Song dynasty, which is more than a millennium later, right? It's more than 1,000 years. It's a long time after the birth of Confucius. Confucianism had developed into this vast, sprawling, multi-factional, multi-sectarian tradition, just as Buddhism and Christianity, Islam, Judaism, just as all of the great religious and philosophical traditions have. So the Confucianism of later China and eventually all over later East Asia, so the Confucianism that we associate with Neo-Confucianism and Zhu Xi eventually became orthodoxy all over East Asia, including places like Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. And what's interesting about this is exactly as Richard suggested, is that in many ways they're taking some core ideas that come primarily from the political, social thought, and ethics of the classical Confucian tradition and adding a lot more of what I think of as the technical apparatus that we now associate with philosophy these days. So terms of art, like technical terms, terms that people are arguing about. What do they mean? Arguments, systematic kind of worldviews, understandings of the cosmos and its fundamental principles and the foundations of ethics and all those things, epistemology, even I would say the Buddhist interest in what I sometimes think of as mental discipline, things like meditation, even that Confucians felt like they had to provide a Confucian response to. So there are Confucian alternatives to Buddhist meditation. So it's very much a response to Buddhism, maybe arguably a kind of philosophical religious tradition that adopts some parts of Buddhism as well as Taoism. And it's also just in some ways more recognizably the philosophical tradition. Just as we now think, when we think of philosophical Christianity, when we think about the philosophical articulations of Christian principles and, a kind of Christian theology and metaphysics and so on, we think of Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm, Duns Scotus, and so on, these medieval philosophers. So too do most contemporary Confucians, some true believers of Confucianism, draw upon Zhu Xi and these later Song Dynasty and afterwards Neo-Confucians for that kind of larger, more technical, more systematic worldview that fills out the picture of Confucian philosophy as we know it today. So that will be the subject of our discussion when we meet Steve Engel, our good friend and a former co-author, after the break.
All right, we are back, and we are very pleased to be joined by a very great guest today, an expert in Neo-Confucianism, Confucianism more broadly, and East Asian philosophy, Professor Steve Engel. Professor Steve Engel got his BA from Yale University in East Asian Studies and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan. And he is currently teaching at Wesleyan University, where he's the director of Fry's Center for Global Studies, professor of philosophy, and Mansfield Freeman Professor of East Asian Studies. And Steve is a very well-respected expert and also a really great teacher, having won many teaching awards. And in fact, I can kind of vouch for this because when I started teaching classical Chinese philosophy, I sent an email to Steve some years ago. I don't know if he remembers this, but he sent me generously his syllabus. And the syllabus was just outstanding. And it really broke up all the different texts. And like, for example, like in the Analects, the different passages or different sections connected to particular themes, which was so helpful for me because I had not read the Analects 80 times like Steve has. And so it's kind of tough, when you're first teaching this stuff, because you don't have as great of an organization or structure as you would after having taught it for many, many years. So that was very helpful and really helped me a lot teach the material to students, which I think was very helpful for them. So Steve is an excellent teacher and also, of course, a prolific writer and has published many, many books. The most recent being Growing Moral, A Confucian Guide to Life, published with Oxford, which is an excellent, terrific book, which I think Justin and I would highly recommend.
Yes.
Yes. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, we are too, Steve. So a lot of the listeners who have been paying attention, at least, on a regular basis, know that although I am happy to talk about the classical Chinese tradition, the classical Taoists, Moists, Confucians, and so on, in fact, most of my work is on these later Confucian philosophers. I basically think of myself as working on Confucian philosophers who appeared in the Song Dynasty and thereafter. So Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties especially. And that's much, much later in the history of Chinese philosophy. And so I've often hinted at the fact that there are these later Confucian philosophers who in some ways take just little snippets or hints of ideas that you find in the classical text and develop them into full-blown theories and systematic worldviews. And I've been very eager, I think both of us actually, Richard and I have both been eager to introduce these Neo-Confucians to the audience. But it's intimidating because it seems like for whatever reason, when people introduce Neo-Confucianism, they always start with the metaphysics, which is to say the theories about these fundamental entities, the nature of their existence, the ways in which they depend on one another. Usually the two entities are thought to be Li and Qi, which in our book that Steve and I co-authored a book some time ago, we translate as pattern and vital stuff. So in any case, this is a kind of obscure topic, and yet it seems like you really can't proceed into Neo-Confucianism without knowing something about the metaphysics. And among the historical Neo-Confucians, far and away the most influential one is Zhu Xi. So Zhu Xi was a Southern Song, which is sort of to say later Song dynasty Confucian philosopher. In his day, he was, a popular teacher and he was influential. But it wasn't really until sometime after he died during the Yuan dynasty that essentially his interpretation of the Confucian classics became orthodoxy. They became the basis for the civil service exam in 1313 to 1315. And ever after, not just in China, but all over East Asia, those who aspired to join the kind of most prestigious class, the class of scholar officials, had to really familiarize themselves with and sometimes write discursive essays on, interpretive essays on the Confucian classics as seen through the eyes of or as interpreted by Zhu Xi. So he's really had a tremendous influence. I think there's no equivalent in the West. I mean, it's not the case that people have had to memorize Kant's interpretations of like a Christian treatises or what have you, or scripture, in order to join the scholar official class. So anyway, Zhu Xi is tremendously influential. So we're going to focus on Zhu Xi's theories, his account of pattern, this sort of metaphysical something, what we're going to call it for now. And I've always been sort of intimidated by the thought of trying to explain Neo-Confucian metaphysics to a general audience. And for that reason, plus lots of sort of sentimental reasons, I was hoping that we could recruit Steve to help me out here. And I'm so delighted that we could, because Steve is, first of all, a co-author. We collaborated over the course of many years, actually, on a book called Neo-Confucianism, A Philosophical Introduction. And I think we originally planned to write it in about 2 years, and it turned into, 5 or 6? And fortunately, Steve had a very generous research fund at the time. I did not. So I still remember myself as basically a penniless scholar, relying very much on your generosity, Steve, to fly out to Wesleyan or for you to fly out to San Francisco for us to gather and have these regular meetings. And I still remember those days very fondly. That collaboration was great fun. So that's one reason to have Steve here. But the other reason, frankly, is just that Steve is, how do I put it? He's really a kind of practicing Confucian, where we understand Confucianism to include Neo-Confucian interpretations, interpretations that come from people like Zhu Xi. I think of myself as someone who is like many philosophers nowadays and like many people. I have a kind of buffet style approach to the traditions where I pick and choose the beliefs, the practices that I think are sort of the best of those that are available. And my study of Neo-Confucianism, I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit just for the sake of highlighting a distinction between me and Steve, is I think I'm basically kind of an historian. I mean, I'm interested in the Neo-Confucian philosophers as objects of historical philosophical study. Not so for Steve. As long as I've known Steve, he's always said he is a Confucian. And I know because, Steve, you were working on this, developing your sort of philosophy as a way of life class back at the time that we were working on the book together, that you actually do encourage your students to adopt various practices recommended by people like Zhu Xi and take very seriously the ideas that we find in the text of Zhu Xi and other Neo-Confucians like Wang Yangming. So it just seems like if we want to really motivate Neo-Confucian metaphysics, we couldn't do better than to bring Steve on board. So I'm very grateful to have your help, Steve. All right, so let's begin with a quick introduction to Neo-Confucianism and Zhu Xi, just to kind of provide the listeners with some historical context. And then I will talk about Li or pattern in particular. All right, so here's what I can say about Neo-Confucianism, and this is why I think it's worth knowing much more about Neo-Confucianism than you probably do. Basically, the reason that it's worth your while to learn more about Neo-Confucianism is comparable to the reason why it's worth your while to learn more about later Christian philosophy if you understand Christianity. So if you think, let's just say you meet someone that you consider to be a well-informed Christian, we'll call her Mary, all right? You're probably going to make some assumptions about her that have to do with what we'll call sort of doctrinal views, a kind of spiritual framework that she adopts, basically her views that we tend to associate with Christian doctrine that she has. So, for example, you will probably assume that she has this view about original sin, about the need for God's grace to overcome this sinful nature. We'll probably assume that she has some views about the immortality of the soul, the afterlife, and so on. Now, where do those views actually come from? It's tempting to say they come from the Bible. And I think most people who are familiar with the Judeo-Christian Bible will say yes and no, right? I mean, the Judeo-Christian Bible is somewhat determinative of what we now consider to be Christian doctrine, but only somewhat. I mean, the raw text itself, the scripture itself, can be interpreted in a wide range of ways. And that's why there's so much controversy among the various sects, right? The various sort of factions or religious orientations that call themselves Christian ones. And so actually, a lot of the stuff that we consider to be Christian doctrine comes from medieval philosophy. It comes from people like St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas. Similarly for Confucianism, a lot of the stuff that people take for granted nowadays as being part and parcel of the Confucian worldview actually comes from Neo-Confucian philosophers like the Chung brothers, Zhu Xi, who was really trying to synthesize the Chung brothers and a number of kind of lineages that followed in their footsteps, and also people like Wang Yongming. So there's a sense in which you're not really grasping Confucianism as a systematic philosophical worldview until you've started to study Neo-Confucianism. That's one of the reasons why we thought it was important to introduce our listeners to Neo-Confucianism.
Can I make one point there, Justin? Because I really like this analogy with the Christian tradition, because also you mentioned Augustine and Aquinas. The other thing that people sometimes forget is they were deeply influenced by, well, especially Aquinas, by Jewish scholars and philosophers like Moses Maimonides, as well as great Islamic thinkers like Averroes, Avicenna, and so on. And so in the same way, as we'll get into, I bet, Neo-Confucian thinkers like Zhu Xi was also influenced by many of the great traditions of his time and thinkers of his time, including Buddhist scholars and Taoist thinkers and so on. So I think it also kind of shows the parallel there in that the tradition develops also is enriched by conversations with thinkers from other traditions as well and other systems of thought.
Yes. Thank you, Richard. That particular way of depicting Zhu Xi plays right into my hands, I must say, because I've always been partial to this reading of the Neo-Confucian tradition and of Zhu Xi in particular, according to which he's quite influenced by Buddhism and especially Buddhist metaphysics. This is one of those issues Steve and I thought were quite good together as kind of co-authors, but we did have a few topics on which we were sort of friendly rivals. And one of them is that I followed Dai Zhen, this later critic of Zhu Xi, in reading Zhu Xi as quite heavily influenced by Buddhism, especially Buddhist metaphysics. And Steve was, I think, I'm glad you did this, Steve, was rightfully pushing back and trying to highlight what he thought was distinctive about Zhu Xi and his the various ways in which he was trying to separate himself from those Buddhist influences.
Right. There's no question he was influenced by Buddhism, but whether he ends up being essentially a crypto-Buddhist or has his own strong distinctive views, right? That's another question, perhaps for another day.
Yes, exactly. Right. So the influence is uncontroversial. I mean, if you just look at the metaphors he adopts, they come right out of the Buddhist tradition, oftentimes from Chan Buddhism, and a lot of the language he adopts. But of course, one can adopt a lot of the same metaphors and language and put them to different use, right? Or spell out the content of the metaphors differently and so on. Yeah. So, okay, well, let's get into it. The tough issue, but I'm determined to make it intelligible and accessible to the listeners today, has to do with this thing, and I use that word thing under advisement, with a great deal of trepidation, that we're calling Li. Now, Li it's the Dao Li to Li. In modern Chinese, it's the second character of that two-character phrase that sometimes translated as principle or reason. And Li itself is sometimes translated as principle, sometimes translated as reason. We prefer pattern. And I think actually there are different reasons to prefer pattern. Let's just say for now that pattern kind of stands in as a relatively open-ended term that can be interpreted a number of different ways. And that's useful for us because there actually isn't a good English equivalent. There isn't a natural, felicitous English translation of Li. So let pattern kind of stand in as a something that has yet to be filled in with more detail. And so let me give you what I'm going to call a rough account of Li, rough account of pattern. This is one that we will surely revise as we go along, but just to give people a way of wrapping their minds around it, I'm going to say it's an intangible something that accounts both for the nature of things and for a harmonious order of things, a harmonious order that's worth wanting, right? A harmonious order that we actually would rightfully desire to instantiate or bring about. So there's kind of two parts as I'm spelling it out for now. There's the part where Li accounts for the nature of things, right? So the nature of human beings, the nature of squirrels and trees, maybe carts and boats, and also accounts for the kind of harmonious order that we should sort of aspire to instantiate or bring about. So there's a sort of descriptive dimension, if we want to call it that. Anyway, there's a dimension that has to do with the nature of things, what their nature is. And there's a part that has to do with how things ought to be, a so-called prescriptive dimension. So some examples that often come up when talking about Li is they say, well, it's the nature of a boat to float and to travel over water rather than over land. That's the Li of the boat. And then there's a lot we can say about the Li of people. So human beings generally tend to love those who are near and dear to them, like their family members. They have some sort of natural compassion. They have a certain kind of self-respect or integrity, which makes them reluctant to be treated too disrespectfully or cruelly, and so on. And all these things are also the li of human beings, insofar as they're part of our nature. So that's the rough idea. And we thought we would, as always, we have a kind of featured passage that will be the focus of our discussion. So since our philosopher of the day is Zhu Xi, we thought we'd just sort of give you probably the best known account of Li that comes from Zhu Xi. Zhu Xi says many, many things about pattern in many different places, but this is probably the best known description. And Steve had generously volunteered to read it.
I sure will. As is the case with the vast majority of things that Zhu Xi wrote, it's by way of a sort of a commentary, a classic text, right? But stands alone as a definition of this core idea. So it's the context is him talking about the greater learning, the daxue, which is one of the most important early texts. What he says is that, so the passage is, as far as things in the cosmos go, we can be certain that each of them has a reason by which it is as it is and a rule to which it should conform. This is what is meant by pattern, right?
Yes, right. A reason by which it is as it is, or a rule to which it should conform. You will find various translations of this famous passage. Sometimes they'll say, they'll render it the reason by which it's so and the norm to which it should conform. And I think those are perfectly defensible interpretations too. Steve read the translation that came from our book. Yeah, and as Steve mentioned, it's a commentary on the daxue, the greater learning. It's actually in this text known as the daxue Hou, and some questions on the greater learning. Really great philosophical text. So yeah, there are so many things to say about this idea of Li, and I'm tempted to start by sort of defending it against what I think will be a sort of temptation that will come from a lot of people, especially tough-minded, naturalistic, empirical listeners. I don't know how many of those there are, but whenever someone posits the existence of something that is sort of intangible or, not fully, doesn't seem like it's a part of the normal physical universe, that raises some skepticism. They say, well, why should I believe in that, right? And so let me see if I can motivate that a little bit by sort of asking you to put yourself in the mind, the frame of mind of someone living in the Song Dynasty when Zhu Xi did. So let's say that you live in the Song Dynasty and you have really important questions about how you ought to live, what sort of person you should aspire to be, how you should conduct your relationships to others. There are versions of this thought experiment that are more altruistic. You might sort of want to reform the laws as you find them in your community. You find them to be sort of unfair, unjust, not sufficiently compassionate or what have you. Or there are also kind of more selfish versions. You could aspire to some kind of personal happiness or flourishing. And in all those cases, you're going to be asking yourself questions about how you ought to live, what you ought to do. What would constitute greater personal flourishing? What would constitute better laws for your community, right? Insofar as you do that, you're going to be making reference to ideals or improved states of affairs that don't actually exist anywhere, right? So, more just laws, where are those? Where can you, to what do you refer when you talk about more just laws? Greater personal flourishing, what does that look like? And so one of the motivations for positing the existence of this thing pattern is just to explain, first of all, in virtue of what some sort of judgments or beliefs about good laws or bad laws or personal flourishing or lack thereof could be right or wrong, right? So it's a way of kind of grounding those claims. That's important for Zhu Xi because he's worried about this influence of a kind of radical Chan Buddhism, which he thinks allows people to countenance arbitrary personal preferences and proclivities, just, like with tendencies that they happen to have contingently, rather than sort of more objective ground for their moral and ethical beliefs or personal beliefs about flourishing. So that's one thing that's important. But we also just need some way of explaining how you come to know these things, right? Like how it is that you come to recognize what's a good life for you or what's going to be more conducive to your personal flourishing. And so Zhu Xi, like a lot of other Confucians in his day, thinks that we need Li or pattern in order to explain how we do that. And he tells a very interesting story, according to which the Li are, in some sense, our nature. They are constitutive of our nature. Maybe they're identical to our nature, which means that we have a kind of deep and intimate connection, personal acquaintance with them. And moreover, these Li are themselves endowments or manifestations of a kind of greater whole that in our book we call the cosmic Li. I think it's more conventional to translate it as the Li of heaven, the heavenly pattern. In any case, the point is that Zhu Xi, just like many other philosophers in his time, thinks that, you need to have some way of explaining why it is that certain ways of life are better than others, for example, among other things. And why it is that it's sort of like better to use a boat to transport things across water rather than across land. All these sorts of normative claims call out for some sort of explanation in a variety of senses of this word explanation. So that's the kind of work that Li is supposed to be doing.
Can I ask a question here? So the way you kind of motivated Zhu Xi here seemed to be in accordance with the kind of Confucian worldview where we're still aiming for moral self-cultivation and kind of practical orientation and achievement of a flourishing life. So when you look at more of the kind of the ancient Greek scholars like Aristotle, they're also driven, at least Aristotle himself is driven by a kind of curiosity and a quest for knowledge of the world, of the natural world. I was wondering do you think Zhu Xi was ultimately just primarily motivated by the desire to cultivate himself and to understand the world in order to understand how to become good? Or is there also just a kind of thirst to understand the world for its own sake? Because he thinks, look, the broader world, the various things in the world, the objects of the world, and the cosmic whole is intelligible. We can investigate it. In fact, there's that term, right? Go-wu, like the investigation of things. And so I was wondering if he was also independently seeking a kind of rational understanding or grasp of the world as a whole also, or whether or not it was ultimately just subordinated to the kind of practical desires for human flourishing and whatnot.
So if I can offer some thoughts on that, I think it's a really interesting question, but I think that Zhu Xi would push back on the way that you're framing the question, right? So the question depends on the idea that one could investigate nature or the cosmos for its own sake, or are we doing this because we're interested in our own flourishing, something like that, right? And it seems to me that those are essentially one and the same thing as far as Zhu Xi is concerned. And another way to get at this is, I think there's a natural way to read that passage that we started with, where you think that on the one hand, it's referring to facts about the world, things that are independent of us, right? The way the world is out there. And on the other hand, it's saying something about values for us, right? So that might connect up with this idea that whether it's the ancient Greeks or a lot of contemporary atheistic, naturalistic folks who think that, okay, there's facts about the world that science can discover, but values aren't like that, right? The values for us are something more subjective or relative or you might happen to have. What Zhu Xi thinks is that there is no strong distinction between fact and value, even though it kind of appears that way from the passage, right? Because the passage has these two different parts to it. So I think that investigating ourselves, what we find valuable, is the same thing as investigating the cosmos and trying to figure out how the cosmos works, how things fit together in the cosmos. The question of what sort of life should we live is the same kind of question for Zhu Xi as why do we use boats to transport things across water and carts to transport things across the land? There's objective answers to each one, and those answers have to do with how everything fits together, how the structure of the cart fits together with land versus water, with wheels, with the need for human transportation, with the size that humans are, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So,
That's such a great point. The value ladenness of the world. So there isn't this sharp fact value dichotomy, which maybe some of our listeners are unfamiliar with, but it continues to be an extraordinarily important philosophical issue that divides philosophers, whether there is this fact value gap. And it's interesting to see that also other ancient Greek scholars, they also deny, it appears, the fact value gap. A lot of them, I think, including obviously Plato and Aristotle, they thought normativity, as philosophers call it, like having to do with how the world should be, what's good, and so on, permeates the natural world. It's like you look at the oak tree and you kind of have a sense, you can understand what it is for an oak tree to flourish, or when birds migrate, you can observe that they're pursuing their good. And so you can kind of investigate the world and at the same time grasp or apprehend certain forms of normativity inherent in the world. And so it seems like Zhu Xi, as Steve, you were nicely articulating, also seemed to kind of have that kind of basic framework in mind, which is, I think, really fascinating.
Yeah, and if I could build on that point, I think it's seeing the world as suffused in some sense with value and kind of with normativity, with the quality of demanding a change, an improvement upon things. There's a way of understanding it if you just look carefully at the discussions that they have of Li. So what's interesting, this is a point that I think a lot of scholars who work on Neo-Confucian metaphysics today don't often highlight, so that people who aren't so familiar with it sometimes are kind of puzzled by it. But if you look at the discussions of pattern in, just say, between Zhu Xi and his students when they discuss it, one thing that seems to come up quite often is they're puzzled by this idea that some, what they say, dry and withered things, which is to say dead things, could have a Li. So if you look at it in context, Zhu Xi is writing against the background of these earlier Neo-Confucian philosophers, the Chung brothers. By his time, it's sort of well established that everything that is living should have a Li, because you can see every living thing has a kind of flourishing state and a not so flourishing state, which is to say a healthy state and a not so healthy state where it's like fully grown and mature, and, a state where it's kind of weak and sickly or what have you. And they say that comes from the sheng yi, which translates roughly as sort of life impulse of the thing. So the assumption is that, like, for those things that have the life impulse, of course, it's obvious that there's a valuable way for it to be. It's not so controversial, right? You can see in any living thing that there's a valuable way for it to be, and there are less valuable ways for it to be. But every once in a while, you'll see the students say, what about dry and withered things? Precisely because it's understood as more controversial to attribute a kind of Li to a dry and withered thing. And the examples they give are a riding brush, at one point a fan, Zhu Xi, presumably on some hot, humid day, points to his fan and says, it has a Li, and he waves it, because after all, its use has this kind of natural use, which is to fan things. And boats and carts, too, are also made of dry and withered things. It's essentially dead wood, right? So yes, exactly. It's he's trying to show that even dead things have some purpose. They have some sort of normativity. They have some way that they ought to be.
So in the Aristotelian framework, every object has a form, but not everything has a nature, because nature only belongs to living entities, because it's a kind of internal principle of growth, development, maturation. But artifacts can have a form, like a car can have a form, and it has to do with the function and the characteristic activity of a car.
Yeah.
And so it seems like, Zhu Xi thinks, everything has a form, but I guess he would also, I don't know if he distinguishes like natural living organisms versus artifacts like a fan or a boat, because the nature of like a boat, it seems like it's something that's given by the creator, the maker of the object, whereas the natural living organisms, they seem to have their nature in a very different way, or I'm not entirely sure how Zhu Xi would think of that, but the form seems to be something that we can attribute in both traditions across all different entities.
So I guess the way that I would think about that for Zhu Xi is that nothing has a form or nature just on its own, right? So the idea of the ways that everything in the world is interdependent with everything else, which is an example of a place where Zhu Xi is definitely in a sort of a conversation, you could say, with Buddhism, because that's also a centrally important idea for Buddhists. But that notion of the way in which we know what something is, in part by the way that it fits in with other things, right? So this fitting in with is one of the central kind of normative ideas for Zhu Xi. And sure, a creator, on their own could make something that they're thinking of as a boat. But how do we know if it's a good boat, if it really is even a boat, or if it's a toy or a statue or just a crummy boat or whatever, right? We know that because of the way it fits in with broader patterns of activity in the cosmos. So humans living the kind of lives that we do and caring about things is an objective part of the cosmos, right? So the cosmos as a whole is not dead and withered. If the cosmos as a whole is dead and withered, there'd presumably be no Li at all, right? So the fact that there is life and the continual, rebirth and so on is still central to how Zhu Xi understands what Li is about. But it doesn't only apply to things that are actively living, because after all, everything is actively going through processes of change, right? So there's a deeper kind of cosmic interdependence, would
Yeah.
peel back to the Book of Changes. That's probably his most important early text when he's thinking about these kinds of issues, right? So everything is connected. Everything is gradually becoming something else. And one of the reasons that pattern, we always use a capital P for pattern, because it's not just any old pattern, right? It is this kind of funky metaphysical idea. But
Yeah.
one of the reasons that pattern is a good translation is because what Li is, at least in part, is this sort of nesting of interdependent patterns. So the distinction between the cart and the boat is one thing, but they're also related to one another. They have similar kinds of functions, and they're related to, humanity and meteorology and all kinds of other stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this gives us an excuse to introduce another one of the big ideas, kind of almost a catchphrase of Neo-Confucian metaphysics. The Chinese is Li Yi Fen Shu, which translates either as the pattern is one, but its manifestations are many, or as the pattern is one, but its parts are many. But the idea is, just as Steve suggested, that every individual thing, every individuated concrete thing out there, like, this particular cart, this particular boat, this particular person, they have a Li, which is understood as sort of being Li, being properly understood as its pattern, in virtue of belonging to this larger whole, this which they sometimes characterize, which people like Zhu Xi sometimes characterize as Tian Li, cosmic Li, cosmic pattern or heavenly pattern. And that may be, you're the Aristotle expert, Richard. By the way, congratulations on managing to mention Aristotle yet again on the show.
Well, a day is not complete until I mention Aristotle.
But my sense is that Aristotle is, Aristotle really seems to think that the ends of certain things are, is this right, internal to those things? Like the end
That's right.
of
the
the
nature or the form directs the end, and the full realization of one's form or nature is the goal toward which we ought to be directed. Is that what you had in mind?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think in Zhu Xi's case, it's a much more holistic picture, which is
Yeah. It's fascinating. Yeah. So does that mean, like, in order to fully understand, say, the nature of a turtle or the nature of a tiger, we do have to investigate, I suppose, and this makes a lot of sense. You'd have to investigate for sure the environmental conditions under which such beings flourish. That actually, probably Aristotle would say, is also true, but also the way that those organisms interact with other organisms in order to contribute to, let's say, a flourishing ecological system. So you would have to, in order to at least to fully grasp, I suppose one thing Zhu Xi could say is, well, you can have a sense, some grasp or understanding just by examining the squirrel and how it gathers nuts. But in order for you to have a full-blown understanding of the nature of a squirrel, you need to keep investigating more and more broadly to see the interconnectedness with greater and greater spheres of influence, which I think is really interesting and actually quite appealing in many ways, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that if you push that even another step, then we can come back to this kind of fact value idea, or ways in which what you might think of as natural value, the flourishing of the squirrel or something like that, connects up with what we might have thought of as human value or something like that, right? Because given that there are humans in the cosmos and we can make choices, right? That humans are distinctive from animals and from the other sorts of things that are in the cosmos on Zhu Xi's account, in part because we can make bad choices. For the most part, animals are going to do what they're going to do, but humans can do things like, say, produce climate change. Therefore, as we're trying to understand squirrels and the relationship to their ecosystem, as you push that further back, eventually you're going to get to humans. You're going to get to a relationship between human flourishing, between things that we're doing, which are having influences on the squirrels and on all kinds of other things that are in turn interrelated to the squirrels. And so I think that this perspective, and Zhu Xi thinks that there's ultimately an objective right answer if we try to continue to think about how best can everything fit together in a way that supports life, right? So we're going to get to being able to talk about climate change and have an objective sense of what's right and wrong about that. And, similarly for, say, like oppressive labor conditions or whatever it is, right? Everything's going to be connected up. The computers that we're using right now are produced in a certain environment under certain labor conditions and matters of global trade and so on and so forth. All of that matters ultimately to thinking how best we meaning we as part of the cosmos can fit together. That's Li.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I did want to quick ask this question before because Justin quoted that very famous passage from Zhu Xi about Li is one, but its manifestations are many. And there's always this puzzle and I haven't studied Neo-Confucianism to the extent that you both have. And so one thing you realize is there's a sense of the universal Li, which I think is sometimes called heavenly Li. And that's one. And it's almost this metaphysical pattern or principle. And then there's a sense in which there's also a kind of nature that every single thing has, and that nature is Li. So is there ultimately just different senses of Li that we find in Zhu Xi's text, where on the one hand, we got the ultimate kind of metaphysical principle or pattern, and then on the other hand, there's like individual nature or Li that exists and is different. We could also say they're different from one kind of being to another. Because yeah, that issue of the universal and the individual, I always find a little bit puzzling, and I think it is puzzling for anyone who first tries to get into Zhu Xi or Neo-Confucianism.
Right. Well, whenever you say something's one and many, you're going to be asking for questions, right?
Yes.
I would say that Zhu Xi's pretty insistent that the cosmic pattern or the heavenly principle, however you want to translate Tianli, and the pattern of an individual thing are in an important sense the same. They're one. And so one way you can think about that is imagine a sort of infinitely complex nested set of patterns, right? This crazy like fractal lattice or something like that. And that whole thing is Tianli. Now let's look for the boat. And there's going to be, so you imagine you've got some giant machine, you push the boat button, and a little bit of that thing is going to highlight in a sort of a deep color. And so a few other things are going to highlight in slightly less deep colors, right? Those are going to be the things that are most salient about Tianli as it applies to that particular thing, right? So as an analogy, we can say, okay, that is the Li of the boat. And it's going to be quite different from the Li of the cart or the chipmunk or whatever. But you can get from boats to carts and from either of them to chipmunks because they are ultimately interdependent on one another. And part of what it is to be a boat, albeit a very, very minor part, has to do with chipmunks.
So if you fully grasp the Li of a chipmunk, you would grasp the Li of every single thing?
Yep. But let me say, right, if you think of it in too much of a sort of abstract, right, I've got to understand the job of ethical cultivation is to understand every single interdependency related to a chipmunk, right? That's actually a problematic way to think about what Gewu, right? What this getting a handle on things or investigating things, what this process of personal growth is supposed to be like. And famously, it's the approach that later rival of Zhu Xi took, right? So Wang Yangming said, okay, I'm going to sit here and meditate in front of a stalk of bamboo and try to fully understand everything there is to understand about this bamboo. And he got sick. It did nothing for him, right? So it's not so much that we have to try to grasp everything and all of its interdependencies all at once, right? Partly what you have to grasp is that idea, the general idea that things are interdependent in that way. But you do a lot more work, even for Zhu Xi, a lot more work within yourself, trying to grasp sort of how your own psychology works and the way that you are related to others in your immediate vicinity. But it isn't only internal, because you don't want to end up with just some kind of subjective, well, this is what I feel like right now. So there's a kind of back and forth working sort of self-work that goes in tandem with paying attention to other sorts of evidence that are outside you of how things fit together well.
Yeah, I mean, I understand Richard's puzzlement, though. It does seem like there's a kind of slide between talking about universal Li and the Li of specific things or types of things. And Zhu Xi, I mean, there are on certain readings, like Chen Lai's reading, Zhu Xi actually changes his mind about the Li of types of things over the course of his life. So I think you're right to have some concern there. But like at first pass anyway, one thing we can say is, well, there's Tianli, the sort of heavenly pattern or the cosmic pattern of the cosmos. And then there are its specific instantiations or parts, and it's instantiated differently in different bodies or conglomerates of qi, of vital stuff, right? So vital stuff has a certain shape for a squirrel and a certain shape for a human being, and also different shapes for different types of different human beings, different individuals. So yeah, one thing I did want to sort of emphasize, though, while we're talking about Neo-Confucian metaphysics and comparing it with Greek metaphysics like Aristotle's has to do with this idea that the Li is internal. So Steve said that when you engage in a kind of self-cultivation, the way Zhu Xi envisions it, there's a back and forth between kind of self-discovery and discovery of the world. One interesting thing about Li is that as Zhu Xi understands it, it is both out there and also manifested in you. So there's a sense in which it's fully endowed in you. It's just that you best discover it by looking outward. You can't trust your own introspection to discover it alone.
Whereas
Not
Wang
more.
Yangming thought you should introspect more. He goes more in that direction, right?
More emphasis for sure. So you can't trust introspection alone, according to Zhu Xi, for sure. But if you were to ask him, well, how do we know that our nature is Li in the first place?
Yes.
The first thing he'll say is, well, imagine you saw a baby about to fall into a well.
Yes. Yes.
Right? That famous passage from Mencius, right? This gets back to the idea of finding the cosmos to be value laden, which we were talking about a while ago, right? There are, even though Neo-Confucianism develops beyond classical Confucianism in all kinds of ways, there still are some really critical touch points that they have in common. And while they might interpret this example differently, right, they both put a lot of emphasis on it, right? And so the fact that it's really difficult to imagine seeing that baby fall into a well and not to feel some kind of sadness and commiseration and alarm, right?
Yeah.
For Zhu Xi, what that is a clue to what your nature is.
Yes.
You can't directly experience your nature. Your nature, as when it manifests through qi, through this vital stuff, so you have emotions and so on and so forth. None of that is the intangible Li itself, but there are certain ways in which we can get a pretty darn reliable sense of what Li is, and this is one of them. And there are other pretty reliable ways that we can glimpse sort of evidence of this objective Li.
Mm-hmm.
And the more work we do in terms of getting ourselves to be impartial, unselfish, and so on, the more reliably our emotions are going to be actually able to pick up on, well, what is the way in which everything best fits together?
So you mentioned qi there. Yeah, actually, Justin or Steve, maybe we should say a little bit about the concept of qi, since that seems also very important, and it's also a little bit puzzling, and I'd like to get a gloss on it from an expert.
Well, let me say a couple things and then Justin, you can jump in, because this is something that Justin and I worked a lot on in our book. The core idea of qi for, I think, all of later Chinese philosophy, it's this dynamic stuff that makes up everything that you can sense, right? Everything that you can experience and everything that changes. So it's a little bit like what a modern physicist might call matter energy or something like that. It's, I think, problematic to push that too hard.
Yes.
There's some pretty different frameworks involved.
Because it has psychological qualities too, unlike...
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right.
So if you have an irascible disposition, tendency to get angry, that's part of your qi. Your height is part of qi, and so on and so forth. So we translate it as vital stuff because it's this stuff, right? Things that you can experience, that you can sense, and it's always changing. So thus the vitality. One of the big questions for many Neo-Confucians, big philosophical questions, is how do Li and Qi relate to one another? I don't know how deeply you want to get into that, Justin. What do you want to say?
Yes, that's actually, I would say it's almost like a pastime among scholars of Neo-Confucianism today to give their own interpretation of Zhu Xi's mysterious, sort of underdeveloped comments on the Li-Qi relation. But to make a long story short, Zhu Xi thinks that Li and Qi, in some sense, coexist. So he says in various ways that Li wouldn't exist without Qi. That suggests it's ontologically dependent on Qi, like it wouldn't exist unless it had some Qi to, as he sometimes says, attach to, right? And sometimes to settle in, that's another term he uses.
Even the universally?
That's yeah, you're right. Actually, I read him as being a little bit ambivalent about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And there's some cryptic passages about somehow envisioning a cosmos with no qi. And is it just like a counterfactual sort of thing? Or I would say ultimately that's not a question he's that interested in, because everything worth talking about is there's qi and there's Li. You certainly can't have qi without Li. And Li without qi would be uninteresting.
Yes. At the same time, in the book, we do defend this view that the Li-Qi relationship is one of asymmetrical codependence. So we say they're codependent in the sense that they can't exist without one another. So he specifically says there won't be a Li of a writing brush unless there actually exists a writing brush, right? But that is to say there won't be a pattern for writing brushes unless we actually have Qi that comes together in the shape of and with the function of a writing brush, and so on and so forth for, carts, boats, squirrels, and presumably human beings even.
Now, the way you put that was the Li of a brush. So that seems like a particularized Li in the brush. But then like the heavenly Li seems, yeah, there's a sense in which it seems like it might be different.
Yeah, that's right. There's an interesting question here about the status of concrete particulars or particular individuals as instances of a certain type and the relationship of the individuals to the type and so on. I don't think it's really well spelled out compared to the kind of metaphysics that you're accustomed to, sort of Aristotelian, neo-Aristotelian metaphysics, Richard. But for what it's worth, Zhu Xi is presupposing a kind of background view according to which Qi can be in this state where it doesn't yet manifest as concrete individuals, and then it sort of coalesces and then stabilizes now and then into concrete individuals, and then sometimes disperses again. Yeah, so there is a story about how you get concrete particulars, concrete.
So before the Qi coalesces and takes a more of a concrete shape or form, is there still Li even in that Qi? So even in that kind of very unshaped kind of gooey Qi existential state, is there still Li there?
So now we're getting to that topic that, as Steve and I mentioned earlier, he seems a little ambivalent. So he does say that there's a kind of fundamental Li that he calls Taiji. We translate that as the supreme pivot. Some people translate it as the great ultimate or supreme polarity. It's kind of like fundamental principle that pre-exists heaven and earth itself. Yeah. So even before the Qi differentiates into heaven and earth, there is this, it's predated by this Li in some sense. And yet he also wants to,
and it's not totally wrong to think of that as something like basic laws of physics that structure what happens as the Big Bang gets going, or something like that, right? So there's not a heck of a lot of discussion of that sort of origin process, but there's a little bit. And so the idea that there would be differentiation into two, right? Of course, yin and yang are the kind of two basic modalities that interact with one another according to Chinese cosmology. So that would be perhaps the most basic kind of principle. That's why we think of Taiji as a pivot, right? Pivoting back and forth between yin and yang, these two basic things. And then that unfolds and you begin to get more and more differentiated stuff. And then ever after, even though there's this wax and wane of more solidified and less solidified Qi, right? There's always stuff going on. And so there's lots of sort of determinate Li out there that helps to structure how these various changes take place.
So does Li have causal force? Because that was another puzzle I had as I kept trying to read through the Li Qi metaphysics of Zhu Xi. Because one criticism that I think encountered, maybe it was Ji Lu Liu's explanation about Zhu Xi at the end, was that some scholars criticize him for saying, well, I mean, for his picture, because Li seemed kind of impotent or a kind of metaphysical dangler, is the way that sometimes contemporary philosophers put it, that it doesn't really, it's not exerting any kind of causal force in the world, but then at the same time, it seems integral to objects and the world itself. So there is a real puzzle there, which I actually find quite enjoyable, but am not very clear on myself.
Yes, to use a metaphor that comes straight out of the discourse, and not just the discourse in China, but also in Korea on the Neo-Confucian discourse. It's like Li is the rider on the horse, and Qi is the horse. But then some people worry, given how Zhu Xi goes way out of his way to deny Li this kind of direct control or power to kind of command and order things, isn't he more or less saying that as a dead rider, And so then what is he doing there, And actually, Steve and I became interested in this issue, and we sort of looked around. If one of the nice things about reading Zhu Xi is if you have any puzzlement, if you're reading his stuff and you're thinking, oh, here's a puzzle, here's a question I have that calls out for an answer, chances are good that his students asked him about it. And so indeed, the students do press him on this question because he really makes an effort to say, Li is like a master or a governor of things, of concrete things, But he also says it's not the kind of master or governor that gives orders, that actually sort of causally intervenes in the sequence of events. And so the students, of course, want to know, well, how could he even be a master or governor at all? He offers a number of metaphors. One that we translate in our book is to more or less say, well, it's like the way just having a father, let's just say head of household and be a little less sexist. Having a head of household in the family can affect the behavior of the children. Even if the head of household is not actually giving orders, presumably the kids are going to be, better behaved and they're going to want to do things that they know will please their parent and so on. So it's like that. That's one of the metaphors he reaches for to explain the kind of interesting, sort of non-standard way in which Li can intervene in affairs of the world.
So I'm sorry to do this again because I'm just so much more familiar with Aristotelian metaphysics of matter and form. But the one way that scholars talk about this is, well, matter itself for Aristotle has no intelligibility. It exists, in the physical natural world, but it's form that's intelligible. And so he needs to posit form because it gives the structure shape, which is what allows for us to understand and comprehend and make sense of the world and the objects in it. Is there anything comparable to that it has kind of explanatory force at least? Would that be maybe one way that Zhu Xi might go, or maybe that's not?
Oh, absolutely. Again, Justin and I, in our treatment of this, we talk precisely about the explanatory priority that Li has to Qi. I think explanation is a really good way to go here. And in fact, as we, if we were to go on and try to unpack differences between different Neo-Confucians' views about Li and the relationship with Qi, one of the main things that we would look at is in what ways do they think that Li is actually explaining things? And how does that explanation work? So I think that's exactly the right way to go.
Yeah, intelligibility does help here. One of the reasons Steve is sometimes tempted to use the phrase coherence to translate Li is because he thinks that Li is doing some work in making things intelligible, and the idea of, and so it's attributing a kind of coherence to things as well.
Yeah, the gloss sort of definition for Li that I gave in an earlier book called Sagehood for Li is the valuable and intelligible way that things fit together. So I think that really is central. And it sort of makes clear right in that definition that intelligibility to humans, because that's the only intelligibility that there is part of what it is for there to be Li. And again, we go back to the earlier comments about, with no humans, or even worse or more extreme, with no life, there really isn't Li. And that doesn't mean that we make it up. It's not just what we happen to find valuable. Yeah. There is this very strong objective dimension to Li. And so the fact that you happen to find something valuable or coherent right now, you could be wrong about that.
Yeah.
That's why things like the baby falling into the well are so useful, because we could be wrong, right? You could have somebody who doesn't respond in the standard way or responds too strongly, right? Zhu Xi actually thinks about this, the idea that some of these kind of paradigm reactions can be felt too strongly. So they're not perfect. They're not actually experiencing the Li, but they're very, very reliable windows onto what the Li actually are.
Yeah, could I go back to this point that Steve just mentioned and actually made earlier about how it is that we come to know the Li? He gives examples like the fact that we have this kind of this moral response, this sort of admirable proto-moral response, proto-virtuous response to the child falling into the well that shows that we feel a sense of alarm, compassion for the child. That is a clue, as he says, or kind of evidence that we have Li in some sense. Now, one thing that's distinctive about Zhu Xi that is kind of quickly forgotten, so I think a lot of people who have begun to study Neo-Confucianism don't know this because Zhu Xi's been so successful at defining the Neo-Confucian worldview. But in his time, there was some disagreement about whether Li is the sort of thing that you can directly experience or maybe quasi-perceive, directly encounter, or it's whether it's something that you sort of infer back from, like it's whether it's something you sort of infer its existence and you infer its character on the basis of how it reacts to things. And so there were lineages of Neo-Confucians descending from the Chung brothers, who I really think of as the founding figures, who thought you could directly experience in your own nature Li. And Zhu Xi very famously, experimented with meditation and that sort of thing and found it very frustrating. He felt like he wasn't really encountering or perceiving anything when he engaged in meditation. He's actually a very strong advocate for meditation, but not because he thinks that you encounter Li directly.
So you can't, right? Because it's not perceptible. I guess I'm a little puzzled.
That's his view. Yeah. I mean, so he says, you know of the Li's existence insofar as you can see its reactions in you. So you know that of the Li's instantiation in you. You know the fact that the Li is endowed in your nature insofar as you see how you naturally respond to the child about to fall in the well, how you naturally respond to some bully giving you food with contempt, even though which you're tempted to refuse, even though you're starving.
Yeah.
So, and in seeing how infants respond to their parents, they're kind of deferential to their parents and they love their parents. That's also because the nature of the infant is Li.
Well, in philosophy of science, there are theoretical entities that you can only infer exist from empirical observation and
Yes,
data.
exactly.
So that's still how a lot of disciplines work, I think, that we can infer in that way.
Yeah, right. If you want your objection to Neo-Confucian metaphysics to be just that it's positing the existence of these intangibles, well, okay, yeah, I think people will be quick to say, yeah, well, if you subscribe to a pretty well established understanding of the cosmos, well established by physics, then you're also going to have to posit intangible entities. So,
I mean, another argument in defense of Zhu Xi there is we posit non-tangible entities all the time, like numbers and triangles. And so where's the triangle? I mean, you can't, that's not, you could just draw like on a paper, a triangle, but that's not the nature of a triangle. So
that's right. Yeah. Now we're getting into some really interesting territory. And I'm sure that the philosophical audience, the people who work on Western metaphysics have a lot to say about this stuff. But one major difference between positing, an intangible number or an intangible form of justice, if we want to kind of go the Platonic route or what have you, or an intangible law of gravity, right, is that in the case of sort of Western metaphysics, these intangibles are external. Whereas Zhu Xi has what I think of as a pretty ambitious metaphysical view that the patterns, the Li, or the various parts of Tian Li, of cosmic pattern, are both external and in some sense fully endowed in you, which explains why it's natural for you to respond to the child who's about to fall in the well with a sense of alarm and compassion. And so that's a very tricky issue in what sense it's external, in what sense it's internal. But I think it's very important for Zhu Xi and for the other Neo-Confucians that it be internal. Why is it important? Because Zhu Xi is not satisfied with this idea that you can come to know pattern in the way that you come to know external things. Why is that? Well, because external knowledge of external things isn't necessarily transformative, isn't necessarily wholehearted. You can know, that it's right or wrong, I don't know, to cheat on your next exam or what have you, but still have a powerful internal temptation to do so if you know that the stakes are high, right? If it's internal, however, then there's some very real likelihood or hope, basis for hope, that you could eventually come to wholeheartedly embrace these ethical norms so that there's no part of you that's participating in them reluctantly, so that you're fully on board with these ethical norms and you're not even tempted to cheat on the exam or what have you. And this is something that we mentioned in the book, Steve and I do, and something I've written about separately too. I tend to read the later Confucians, the ones who decided that basically Mencius had to be right about human nature and not Xunzi, that human nature had to be good and not bad or neutral, as having an implicit wholeheartedness criterion, for their ethical worldview. Whatever the ethical worldview is, which we can sort of spell out in terms of beliefs or judgments or kind of big picture norms, it has to be such that it's one that we could, in principle, under sort of the best circumstances, come to embrace wholeheartedly. Essentially because the later Confucians are virtue ethicists, and they're interested in ethical norms that we can adopt as virtuous agents. And virtuous agents are people who actually want to be ethical. They're not people who do it reluctantly out of a sense of duty, grudgingly. So it does seem important that to Zhu Xi and to a lot of the later Confucian philosophers, that pattern be internal, precisely because they want it to be possible for us to adopt the norms that they associate with pattern wholeheartedly. That's one way in which discovering Li isn't going to be like discovering laws of gravity or mathematical axioms.
Triangularity. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So Shunzi, obviously, as we talked about, would, I guess, deny that because he thinks you could still come to wholeheartedly commit yourself to the Confucian way. But the thought here is you need the pattern, the goodness inside of you already in order to have the kind of psychological unity to be completely committed.
Yes.
Okay. No, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what to say to that.
Yeah. Well, it raises another issue that comes up in Steve's most recent book, Growing Moral, which has to do with this sort of, I want to call it the kind of religious or spiritual doxastic status, the status having to do with belief of the Neo-Confucian belief in pattern. So given that we've talked about it as something intangible, so we can't, it's not, somehow intangible things are a little harder to believe in than things like trees and cats and windows and things that you can look at and touch and feel. And given that Zhu Xi himself admits that you can't directly experience it, you have to sort of infer its existence from the ways in which your nature and the nature of other things react to the world, you might think that people have doubts about the existence of pattern. And Zhu Xi in particular is sometimes worried about a view that he sees as sort of Chan Buddhist, which is another way of saying Zen Buddhist. Chan is the Chinese pronunciation of the same character that is pronounced Zen in Japanese. He's worried about people who tend to just take their own arbitrary contingent reactions to things and say, this is my Buddha nature, guiding me. Mm-hmm. He wants to say, no, there's objective criteria we can use to revise our beliefs and our practices, and we shouldn't just countenance any old whim that we happen to have. So he wants to establish that these things exist and they're objective in some sense. But does that require a leap of faith? There are a lot of interesting issues here that I suspect our listeners can already detect. Is this a religious view? And is it a religious view in virtue of having a kind of big picture spiritual vision that we're supposed to aspire to? And is it a religious view in virtue of requiring a leap of faith or some kind of like strengthening of our confidence that we wouldn't normally be called upon to provide in the normal course of forming beliefs and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I think those are two different ways of framing the question. So
Yes.
Is it a religious view in the sense of having sort of a sense of ultimacy and
Yes.
and so on? We could trot out the standard definitions of religion that departments of religious studies tend to have.
Yeah.
And according to those understandings of religions, absolutely, it's a religious view. I think there's no. Is it a religious view? Now, probably most people think of a religion along the lines of the religions that themselves are familiar with. And for many folks, that's going to be some variety of Christianity or another monotheistic tradition. And for some of those traditions, not all equally, but for some of those, a particular notion of faith is really important, right? Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a leap of faith. If we think of faith as something that is, for which evidence is not relevant, right? It's not just that it goes beyond your current evidence. Mm-hmm. Evidence is not in the conversation, right? Something else. Faith is something else. Now, that's not every way to talk about faith, but that's a particular, Protestant, Kierkegaardian maybe way to think about faith. So I don't think that's necessary for religion. I go with the religious studies folks and having a much broader understanding of what a religion would be. But I would also say that kind of leap of faith is not what the Neo-Confucians are talking about, not what Zhu Xi is talking about, because I think evidence does matter. So there is this conceptual fact that Richard was pointing towards about, well, if something is fundamentally intangible, then you can't, tange it, right? You can't experience it. You can't actually sense it. So we can't straightforwardly experience Li. But there's a lot of evidence. This is on Zhu Xi's account, right? Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of ways in which we can have good grounds for thinking that actually there is a way the world can fit together better than it does now. We can sense and have this, Neo-Confucians love to talk about joy, this kind of joyous experience of harmony. Sometimes, in some kind of limited circumstances, I think it's possible to feel what Zhu Xi talks about, which is, wow, everything is fitting together so beautifully. And whether it's the relationship between the sort of natural world and human architecture or human relationships or, different sorts of values that one's experiencing. I remember, so Richard mentioned at the outset that as an undergrad, I went to Yale, and I remember the experience of walking onto Yale's old campus at night, surrounded by this beautiful quadrangle with lights coming from all the windows in a beautiful fall evening, and just having a little bit of this, like, wow. On the corners of my awareness, I knew that not everything was perfect in the world, right? But I think that so anyways, going on too long. The point being that I don't think that Zhu Xi conceives of this as a leap. I think it's something that we get flashes of in limited ways. And so the notion that there is a way of inhabiting the cosmos that really realizes the values that are objectively present is something that we can, if you kind of attend in the right way, that you can experience.
Yeah, that's right. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about faith. And to those of us who were raised either in the shadow of or actually in Protestant Christianity or in Protestant Christian contexts are familiar with this sense of faith, which taken to its extreme, we sometimes call Kierkegaardian, associated with Soren Kierkegaard, where you believe something over and above, or maybe we should say in spite of the evidence, right? So sort of as an act of will on Kierkegaard's account. And the Confucians don't endorse faith in that sense. There's another sense of faith, which is something like earned faith, faith that's warranted. This is not a particularly controversial thing. I mean, we all say, like, I want to know I need a good relationship coach, like I want to figure out how to better handle my relationships. And I have evidence that someone, we'll call her Mei Hua, is really good at it because she's handled relationships very well and she's given me good advice in the past. I now have warranted confidence in her advice. That's a kind of faith in Mei Hua. And it's maybe the structure of faith or belief in Li is like that. I actually think it's a little bit, my own reading of Zhu Xi is that he thinks the reasons we have to believe in Li and to sort of see it, take sort of discovery of Li and the manifestation of Li, accordance with Li as a major life project, as both evidential grounds and non-evidential grounds, but they're all relatively reasonable grounds. So on the one hand, he thinks they're little glimpses of evidence that we see in people's natural behaviors, in our own natural behaviors, what comes naturally to us. On the other hand, there's what I want to call a kind of rational hope or rational basis for hope that you can become a virtuous person, that you do have the potential to become a sage. And that's a relatively, it's not evidential basis. I think it's more of like a pragmatic one or a moral one, but there's still good reasons, So if you must place your bets, it's better to place a bet on the worldview that still holds out some reasonable hope of you becoming a better person.
Right. In a sense, it seems like I'm going to go out on a limb here because I don't know much about the actual details around Pascal's wager, right? But remember, of course, that a lot of the content of Confucian education is reading about ancient sages and worthies, right? People who did, or at least are put forward as actually attaining this kind of a status, or at least making a lot of progress, right? Most of them weren't full on 100% sages. Maybe there's no such thing as a permanent sage. It's a, ongoing achievement, whatever. That's a whole nother story. But in terms of evidence that we might be able to become like that, our experiences are not so different from those of these ancient exemplars. So that's part of why you read these books, is to try to then find resonance between with the stories you're reading and their experiences and how they respond to different situations and your own.
Yeah. If I could, though, since while we're on the topic of religion and religious faith, I did want to say something that I see as a kind of point in favor of Confucianism over and against, say, Buddhism or the more recognizably sort of religious traditions that Confucianism competed with historically. And that is that on what we now think of as pretty speculative matters like the afterlife, I read Neo-Confucians like Zhu Xi as basically taking what I want to call an agnostic stance. That's not to say that they were themselves agnostic. If you read Zhu Xi's discussions with his students, you can find lots of speculation about ghosts and spirits and what happens to the spirits of your ancestors, what's really happening when you sacrifice to them. But I read Zhu Xi as following Hu Hong and others and saying, well, officially we Confucians don't care that much about how it works, how exactly spirits are, whether they're broken up into different parts and whether they survive and whether they're receiving the sacrifices that you leave out for them and so on. And that's because for us, the locus of value is in this life. And we don't want to ground or base an entire kind of vision for how you ought to live, a vision of the way, on something so speculative as the afterlife. So that's a kind of commitment that goes all the way back to the Analects when Confucius says to Zulu, his student, you don't understand life. Why are you worrying about death? You don't understand how to serve people. Why are you worrying about serving ghosts and spirits? It's this commitment to, to basically instantiating value in this life and not in the next one. And Neo-Confucianism has features of a kind of religious worldview, but I think it doesn't require quite the heroic commitments that a lot of other religions do.
At least not those heroic commitments.
Yes, that's right.
For sure. Right. No, I think that's right. That the question of whether there's some kind of immortality of the soul or life after death or so on, there's lots of debates over it, but they are I think, fundamentally of a piece with what we might think of as debates about matters of natural science. These are things about the cosmos that we're not too sure about. But there's nothing outside the cosmos or after the cosmos. There's just the cosmos. And so we build our lives on the values that we have the strongest evidence for, and that's plenty. And it doesn't, I think, rule out religiosity.
Yeah, great.
All right, Steve. Well, we had a really rich conversation here and very wide ranging. And thank you for indulging in some of my own questions today.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
And this was great. And of course, this is such a complex topic. And so I'm sure we'll get back to it eventually. We like to close each episode with one question for our guest. For today, we want to ask, what is one idea or conceptual point or practice that comes from the Chinese text that you have studied for so long, which you would recommend to people that you think might help them live a better human life?
Okay. Wow. That's a great question. And I think that in one sense, I literally wrote a book to answer this question. But let me choose something that is very much near and dear to Zhu Xi's heart. And a couple words I think that haven't come up in our conversation, or if they did, it was only just briefly in passing. So Zhu Xi's sort of central teaching about how to actually make progress as humans, how to become better people, is something that Justin and I translate as reverential attention. In Chinese is just one word, jing, which is literally reverence, but we want to bring out the importance of attention. And I think that, this really ties in with a lot of what we've been talking about, the importance of attending to one's world. And Zhu Xi talks about the kind of the focus, the centeredness that one should have. And there's a lot of practices that enable that. You're not just sort of single-mindedly paying attention to whatever is right in front of you. The idea of reverential attention is that you're paying attention to your environment, but you're doing so in a way that sort of has in the background the notion that this here in front of me is part of the glorious life-giving cosmos. And so reverence, connecting up to what we were talking about in terms of religion, right? Reverence isn't about a particular belief in some doctrine or another. Reverence is about finding awe, finding wonder in what's right in front of you. And I think that is an idea which in different ways you might find in different sorts of religious traditions. But for Zhu Xi, it's front and center that we should have reverential attention or cultivate the ability to engage with our environment with reverential attention.
Yeah. If I could just second that, I think it's interesting because Steve regularly teaches a philosophy as a way of life course, which is to say one of these philosophy courses that's meant to provide you with actual practices that you adopt in the course of your life, not just make sure you have the right view about what a scientific hypothesis is or, what the nature of knowledge is. And I occasionally teach it. The one topic in which I'm willing to just assign Zhu Xi to my students without a lot of, prior kind of prep work in terms of his special use of terms and metaphysics and so on, is on reverential attention in reading. So he has this really rich stuff that comes out in discussions with students about how you should adopt this particular attitude that he calls reverential attention in your reading of not just of classics, but basically all of your reading, certainly your philosophical reading. And one way I tend to put it, I don't know if you agree with me, Steve, is that he's looking for some kind of Confucian alternative to Buddhist mindfulness. And in order to articulate what he thinks is necessary to get a proper Confucian attitude toward the text going, he thinks that you have to give up on this idea of value neutrality. So if you've ever taken a kind of standard Buddhist meditation course, you know that you're not supposed to judge, if your mind starts to act up, and starts to wander off. They call it the monkey mind. It's tempting to say, oh, that's wrong. I shouldn't do that. It's bad. And a good Buddhist teacher always says, no, don't judge yourself. There's no right or wrong. That's precisely the sort of state that interferes with mindfulness. Zhu Xi thinks, no, that's not right. It is a valuing attitude that you're supposed to adopt with respect to everything that calls for reverential attention. Now, in the material that I have in mind, he's thinking of texts. He's thinking of, reading histories and philosophical texts, poetry, that kind of thing. But he's also thinking of just meeting people and conducting rituals. This term jing that Steve mentioned is understood paradigmatically as the attitude you're supposed to adopt when you are performing a ritual properly. So anyway, for what it's worth, if you read Daniel Gardner's translation of Zhu Xi on learning under the title Learning to be a Sage, In that case, he translated it back when people still romanized Zhu Xi's name the old way, Zhu Xi, Chuhsi. You can look it up. In any case, if you read that translation, you'll see so much rich stuff on reverential attention. There it's translated as intermental attentiveness, but it's not just a matter of recommending the attitude to you. He tries to give you a sense of what it's like. So he asks you to imagine the posture, the bodily posture that you adopt when you're performing a ritual respectfully. You're standing up straight, your shoulders are square, and so on. That's the sort of stuff that's supposed to help you get inside the frame of mind, the kind of phenomenological view of reverential attention. So it is very rich. And I'll just say I assigned it to my classes too, just because it's amazing. So I'm sorry for the long-winded seconding of Steve's recommendation, but I fully agree. It's good stuff.
Always happy when we agree, Justin.
Yeah, I am too. Yeah. What a relief. Well, so I think that covers it. And we will thank Steve for his excellent participation and contribution to the discussion today. It was really wonderful to have you here, Steve. We were looking for an excuse to bring you on, and this was a very good one. We recommend Steve's most recent book, Growing Moral, among others, that we will include in the show notes. And I suppose we'll say that was the way for today. See you next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.